let's start with our prayer for study on page 185. Oh, Dominic, can you just take this to Miriam? This is her, it's a little tight fit there. It's all right. You guys are good about it. All right. Christ, my Lord, the giver of light and wisdom, who opened the eyes of the blind man and transformed the fishermen into wise heralds and teachers of the gospel through the coming of the Holy Spirit, shine also in my mind the light of the grace of the Holy Spirit. Grant me discernment, understanding, and wisdom in learning. Enable me to complete my assignments and to abound in every good work. For to you I give honor and glory. Amen. Most blessed Lord, send the grace of your Holy Spirit on me to strengthen me, that I may learn well the subject I am about to study, and by it become a better person for your glory, the comfort of my family, and the benefit of your church and our nation. Amen. All right. Finally reading some fiction again. Maybe some of you rejoice in that. Maybe some of you just really loved the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. I actually had a student who came in before Thanksgiving and said he just decided to read all of the Federalist papers because he was interested. Awesome. I did not expect many people to do that, though, or any people to do that. Let's take a look at our poems. They're on page 85. And John Keats is another one of our romantic poets. And remember, romantic doesn't mean he just writes about love all the time. It means he's interested in feelings. And can somebody remind me what's happening at the time that made a group of people say, we need to think more about feelings and emotion? What were people teaching or doing or thinking that made people want to push back and say, what about feelings?
Was it because everyone, like, people that believed in cause theories, like, only reason they didn't like it?
Yeah.
Like,
It's our friend Descartes. My teacher for the classes that I'm taking, we're doing math, and Descartes pioneered algebra and the Cartesian plane and everything. We were reading, and he always refers to him as Descartes, the father of all evil. And I'm not sure if he's serious or not. He was looking with a smirk. He's like, oh, next week we'll read Descartes, the father of all evil. So yeah, people were very concerned with what you could weigh and measure and test in a lab, but not so much about what makes us human. In other words, let's be Winhams, just led by reason. But this group of people said, that's not what people are like. So Keats is in that group as well. And so the first poem, La Belle Dame sans merci, the beautiful woman without mercy, in French, that's what it means. And it's a little odd. I will just read it. Ah, what can ail thee, wretched wight, alone and palely loitering? The sedge is withered from the lake, and no birds sing. Ah, what can ail thee, wretched wight, so haggard and so woebegone? The squirrel's granary is full, and the harvest done. I see a lily on thy brow, with anguish moist and fever dew, and on thy cheek a fading rose fast withereth too. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairy's child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wild. I set her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long, for sideways she would lean and sing a fairy song. I made a garland for her head, and bracelets too, and fragrant zone. She looked at me, and she did love and make sweet moan. She found me roots of relish sweet, and honey wild, and manna dew, and sure in language strange she said, I love thee true. She took me to her elfin grot, and there she gazed and sighed deep, and there I shut her wild sad eyes, so kissed to sleep. And there we slumbered on the moss, and there I dreamed, ah, woe betide, the latest dream I ever dreamed on the cold hillside. I saw pale kings and princes too, pale warriors, death pale were they all, who cried, La belle dame sans merci hath thee enthrall. I saw their starved lips in the gloam, with horrid warning gaped wide, and I awoke, and found me here on the cold hillside. And this is why I sojourn here alone and palely loitering, though the sedge is withered from the lake and no birds sing. What happened to him?
Well, it seems like he was dreaming and something.
He certainly was dreaming at the end, because he says, I slept and I saw pale kings. When people are pale, what does it usually insinuate? Yeah, like they're ghosts. What were you going to say, Dominic?
They fell for the temptation. It's kind of like what the lady was, I think, supposed to represent, temptation in itself.
Perhaps. Do you guys, some of you, years ago now for some of you, read King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table with me? And do you remember there were these creepy women who would just show up? How else to describe it? And then they would like tempt, oh, sir, whoever, come into my pavilion, and if he refuses her or whatever, then the wind blows and just everything disappears and the wind blows away. It seems perhaps like one of these situations, doesn't it?
Aren't they like supposed to be like fae or something?
They're fae. And it says she's a fairy's child. Particularly like fairies myself. In the Middle Ages, there was an idea that all spaces should be filled. Like every space in the universe should be filled. Every space in the world should be filled. And there's animals in the ocean, there's animals on land, there's animals in the air, And so if we are this sort of creature that's midway between angels being pure reason, and the non-fallen ones beyond moral culpability at this point. Animals have no moral sense at all. Like a lion eats you, and I'm sorry that the lion ate you, but it's not the lion's fault. It's not a sin in the lion, right? And then we have people, but they would speculate, but what about the spaces in between? So what about animal creatures that are rational but not moral? Like what if there was something between us and animals? And it had reason. It could plan and think things out, but it wasn't necessarily a morally responsible creature. And so you have these like elves and fairies and this sort of creature. And we're sort of smiling, but they took it quite seriously. And honestly, guys, there's no reason it has not been proved wrong. Especially because they live in a different dimension. You can't find them always. And, at one point, like 150 years ago, 100 years ago, if somebody said, there are these creatures that live in another dimension, and maybe you can find them, maybe they not, and, and people are like, oh, that's crazy talk. But now, like, physics is so weird, and, like, light is a particle, light is a wave. Like, we don't know what in the world's going on. And they tell us things like, that table is just a mass of atoms that are all moving. And like, what? It's all weird now, and so it's kind of sounds like so weird. Like, oh, there's creatures that, they live in sort of a parallel dimension, and they can make themselves seen if they want or not. But anyway, I don't know why Keats picked that, a fairy woman, for his topic, except that it was kind of a throwback to the romantic medieval time, right? And so, yeah, fae, fairy. This story could be straight out of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, so that was good noticing on Dominic's part. The second poem is on first looking into Chapman's Homer. First of all, you have to know who Homer is. Hopefully most of you know. Homer is a Greek poet, author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Chapman is a translator. He did a translation of the Iliad into English. And this is a poem about reading that translation. I don't know when the last time is you read a book and you felt compelled to write a poem about the reading of the book. If you feel it, you should do it. Like if A Tale of Two Cities, like I try a poem about the reading, on first reading Dickens or something like that. But Keats felt that way. Let's take a look and see how he felt about it. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. I'm going to stop, because this is a sonnet It's got 14 lines. It's got the sonnet look. And remember our 4 lines, 4 lines, 4 lines? He's telling us something in those 4 lines. Where's he been?
Realms of gold.
He's been all over the place. Where are these realms of gold?
Around many Western islands, is that what you mean?
Possibly. Who's the king of those places?
Apollo.
Oh, no. And who's Apollo?
Oh, he's a Greek god of the sun, right?
Uh-huh, and what else?
What's it called?
The arts. How those the arts?
Poetry and the lyre and the arts. Who are bards? What's a bard? Not the guy who shot. He is, but this is a different
Is it
one.
like a minstrel?
It's a minstrel. It's a traveling performer of poetry. So he says, I've traveled all over the place, places that bards rule over in fealty to Apollo. Are these literal places on the earth?
No.
What are these places he's traveled? What are the areas that Apollo is the king over and bards are his sub-rulers? Poetry. It sounds, you start this poem and it sounds like he's been around. He's traveled all over some cool places. He's saying, I've read lots of poetry, is what he's actually saying. Okay. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet never did I breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Oh, there was one area of this land Homer was always the king of. It's the Trojan War, right? It's the Iliad. I heard he was king of that area, but I never really understood till I read Chapman's version. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. All right, the first part's easy enough. Can you imagine what it would feel like to be a professional astronomer and find a new planet? I feel like that doesn't happen all the time. I feel like if you get to be one of those guys, that makes you feel really awesome. Or he said, like Cortez. Where's Cortez and his men? In Central America, right? Picture a map of Central America. Everybody got it? North America, South America, and the skinny little isthmus that connects them. Remember, they landed here. Okay, I'll do the back. They landed here, and they thought it was China, right? I mean, they thought this for a long time. It's got to be Asia, right over here. Then they crossed the isthmus. Oh my goodness, there's a whole other ocean over here, right? On a peak in Darien. This is the mountain peak in Central America where they come and they looked and they realized, oh my gosh, we're not anywhere near another mainland. Like, there's a whole other ocean on the other side. When they looked at each other with a wild surmise. I just found a new world. I just found a new ocean. That's what he feels like when he read this translation. Must be a really good translation. That's all I can say. Unfortunately for Mr. Keats, it was Balboa. It wasn't Cortez. It's okay.
You're right.
It's okay. Spanish guy. And Balboa has too many syllables, for the meter. We couldn't really fit that in. So people tease Keats about that. But spend some time with Mr. Keats this week. Read these at least one more time, if not more, now that you've been through them once and know what they're like. Also, on first looking into Chapman's Homer, that's a great memorizable poem. It's a very famous one. Or if you want to be real crazy, La Belle Dame sans Merci, also a very famous one. Okay, let's talk about A Tale of Two Cities. And I think it might be a good idea to talk about a few things because I had some students yesterday that weren't quite clear on a few plot points. So maybe we can make sure all plot points are cleared up before we move on. But this book starts with a bunch of antitheses, very famously, right? It's the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of innocence, it was the period. I don't have it memorized. And remember, unfortunately you can't tell this from my copy of the book because I got tired of the bits falling off and I cut it. It's a tale of two cities. It's not called A Tale of the French Revolution. It's not called A Tale of France or A Tale of Paris. It's a tale of two cities. So Dickens is telling us from the outset, I'm going to be comparing a couple of things here. There's going to be a lot of comparison going on. And of course we get all these, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And then we get comparisons between England and France. And the first question I asked you how England and France are the same and how they're different in this very short first chapter. What's somewhere they're the same? Yeah, Neil.
Both ruled by a king and queen.
They both have a king and queen. There was a king with a large jaw and a queen with a plain face on the throne of England. There was a king with a large jaw and a queen with a fair face on the throne of France. In both countries, it was clearer than crystal to the lords of the state preserves of loaves and fishes that things in general were settled forever. We got everything's good. Everything's good. This is another way that's the same. Everybody in England, things are amazing. Things can't get any better. Everybody in France, everything's perfect. Did we find any differences? I asked you for differences, but they're a little hard.
Catholic, one is Protestant.
Okay, one is Catholic and one is Protestant. Dickens doesn't tell us that, but this is true. He also has this very weird paragraph about the fact that apparently there were lots of mediums, you know what I mean, medium, like fortune teller lady, spiritists in England, that it was quite apparently the thing to hire them. And he said France was less favored on the whole as to matters spiritual. Have all sorts of mediums. Rolled with exceeding smoothness downhill, making paper money and spending it. Under the guidance of her Christian pastors, this is France, she entertained herself, besides, with such humane achievements as sentencing a youth to have his hands cut off and his tongue torn out with pincers and his body burned alive, because he had not kneeled down in the rain to do honor to a dirty procession of monks, which passed within his view at a distance of some 50 or 60 yards. Now, that sounds pretty bad for France. Terrible, terrible punishments, right, for not bowing down to this procession of monks. Like, hands cut off and tongue ripped out, and we're like, oh, boy, glad I don't live in France. France is terrible. Was there anything in the reading that you did for today that showed that England also had some questionable values or punishments?
There was like a lot of protesting going on, like in England, right? Is that what it said? Like it said like mobs and crimes rates were high.
Yes, yes. First of all, we hear in the very next paragraph that crime rates are horribly high. In fact, we have a whole paragraph on it. Does everybody know what it means by a highwayman?
Yeah.
All right, like a robber. It says, in England, there was scarcely an amount of order and protection to justify much national boasting. Daring burglaries by armed men and highway robberies took place in the capital itself every night. Families were publicly cautioned not to go out of town without removing their furniture to the upholsterers' warehouses for security. The highwayman in the dark was a city tradesman in the light, and being recognized and challenged by his fellow tradesmen, whom he had stopped in his character of the captain, gallantly shot him through the head and rode away. The mail was waylaid by 7 robbers, and the guard shot 3 dead and then got shot dead himself by the other 4. That magnificent potentate, the Lord Mayor of London, was made to stand and deliver on Turnham Green by one highwayman, who despoiled the illustrious creature inside of his retinue. It says, in the midst of them, the hangman, ever busy and ever worse than useless, was in constant requisition, now stringing up long rows of miscellaneous criminals, now hanging a housebreaker on Saturday who had been taken on Tuesday, now burning people in the hand at Newgate by the dozen. So that was another punishment, burn their hands. And now burning pamphlets at the door of Westminster Hall. Today, taking the life of an atrocious murderer, and tomorrow, of a wretched pilferer who had robbed a farmer's boy of sixpence. All these things and 1,000 like them came to pass and close upon the dear old year of 1775. And those two of the large jaws and those other two of the plain and fair faces trod with stir enough and carried their divine rights with a high hand. At first we think, oh boy, France is terrible. Later, in a little while when we get farther into your reading, do you recall the courtroom at Charles Darnay's trial?
Yeah.
It was treason trial. Punishment, drawing and quartering. And everybody's like, this is the guy who's going to be drawn and quartered because he's so going to be found guilty. And they all crowd just to see, it said, to see the human being that was going to be ripped into pieces shortly. So it's kind of this creepy interest in violence of others. And Charles Dickens is a lot of things, but he's not subtle. He just kind of really wants you to know certain things. And back in France, he says, it is likely enough that rooted in the woods of France and Norway, there were growing trees when that sufferer was put to death, the guy who had his tongue torn out. There were growing trees already marked by the woodman fate to come down and be sawed into boards, to make a certain movable framework with a sack and a knife in it, terrible in history. What is the movable framework with a sack and a knife? Guillotine. It is likely enough that in the rough outhouses of some tillers of the heavy lands adjacent to Paris, there were sheltered from the weather that very day rude carts, bespattered with rustic mire, snuffed about by pigs, roosted in by poultry, which the farmer, Death, had already set apart to be his tumbrils of the revolution. Carts they're going to load people in to take them to the guillotine. In that dear old year of 1775. Okay. What has happened to Miss Manette's father? At the beginning, we meet Mr. Lorry on his way to France, and he joins up with Miss Manette and her guardian, Lady Miss Pross. What has happened to him? Where has he been?
He's been in prison for 18 years.
He's been in prison for 18 years. Making shoes, but that's not what he started out. We don't know why at this point. And I want to stop here for a moment and read a couple of things. Do you remember I told you there were some things in your reading guide, and I said you didn't have to read them. So it's totally fine if you didn't read them. But they're documents from France at the time. And one of them, it's a man who traveled, or an Englishman, who was traveling around in 1787, 88, and 89. And by the way, 89 is when the revolution sparked off. So right before the revolution. And he's described things he saw. And it's a little journal he kept. And on page 81, the document I put in here, it says, he wrote, "Take the road to Lourdes, where is a castle on a rock, garrisoned for the mere purpose of keeping state prisoners, sent hither by lettres de cachet." Letters de cachet. 7 or 8 are known to be here at present. 30 have been here at a time, and many for life, torn by the relentless hand of jealous tyranny from the bosom of domestic comfort, from wives, children, friends, and hurried for crimes unknown themselves, more probably for virtues, to languish in this detested abode of misery and die of despair. A lettre de cachet was basically a message. Take this person and throw him in a dungeon somewhere and forget about him. Get rid of him. He's a problem. He knows something I don't want him to know. He's doing something I don't want him to do. Throw him in prison and throw away the key. And this has happened to Mr. Manette. We don't know why. There's no clue in what we read that he committed a crime. But he's been imprisoned. And what happened to him there at the beginning of the book? Is he okay? He's not okay, is he? He only, what does he say if you ask him his name?
He says his, what's the old prison number?
Yeah,
No.
number 105 North Tower. Number 105 North Tower. That's all he knows anymore. It's horrifying. And the reason I put this in, this happened. This isn't Dickens being fanciful. This English traveler said, we know it happens. They throw people away. So again, remember our Federalist papers in our Constitution, the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended? Can't do that. France didn't have that. Oh, they could do that. If you have ever read The Count of Monte Cristo, it also involves being tossed in by a letter to cachet. All right, so this is what has happened to Mr. Manette. And does anybody catch what's Mr. Laurie's relationship with these people? Why is he involved in this in any way, shape, or form? What does he do, Neil?
They're business partners in the Tellison Bank Company.
Mm-hmm. He's a banker. He's a banker, and apparently he managed the Manette's funds. He knows Mr. Manette. I don't know if you caught this. I'll bring it up. Has he ever met Lucy, Miss Manette, before? When?
When she was like really young, right?
He brought her to England. He was the guardian that brought her. Her dad was in prison. They told her he was dead. Her mom was dead. And she became a guardian of Tellson's Bank. They kept the money, and they doled it out, and she lived on that, and she had caretakers and things like that. So Mr. Laurie has known her almost her whole life. She does not know him, but he's watched the family. And the very first book the first, is called Recalled to Life. Why? Where does that phrase come in?
Wasn't it when Mr. Laurie and Lucy Manette, when they were talking to him after he came back, and he was like wondering, like, recalled to life, right? Like, or was it that male that they were talking
Okay,
about? Right?
okay. Mr. Laurie, remember what we read in chapter 1? Is it safe to go traveling around in the carriages at night? No. If you hear any footsteps, horse hooves, it's not good at night. They're going to rob you. They're probably going to kill you. But a guy comes up on a horse, and he's actually Jerry Cruncher. I love Jerry Cruncher. Jerry Cruncher, he seems to be his profession?
He's a porter.
He's
That's what he says he is,
Mhm.
but he's very
He's
sketchy.
that's really putting it nicely, Neil. He's a little sketchy. He sends messages for Tellson's Bank. And so he sits on a stool outside Tellson's, and when they say, Jerry, deliver a message, and so he's got a message for Mr. Laurie, and the message is recalled to life. It says, that is not. It says Jerry gives him a message. He opened it in the light of the coach lamp on that side and read, first to himself and then aloud, "Wait at Dover for Mamselle. It's not long, you see, guard. Jerry, say that the answer is recalled to life." Jerry started in his saddle. "That's a blazing strange answer, too," said he at his hoarsest. Take that message back, and they will know that I received this as well as if I wrote. And so they leave, and Jerry's sitting there, and he says, after that there gallop from Temple Bar, old lady, I won't trust your forelegs till I get you on the level, said this horse messenger, glancing at his mare. Recalled to life. That's a blazing strange message. Much of that wouldn't do for you, Jerry. I say, Jerry, you'd be in a blazing bad way if recalling to life was to come into fashion, Jerry. What does this mean? We don't know. But we only know a couple of other things about Jerry. We meet him again sitting outside waiting for messages, and it says, well, actually, let's read the whole thing. How does he treat his wife, Jerry Cruncher? Throws things at her. Yells at her all the time. What's she doing all the time that he objects to? Praying. She's flopping. Stop your flopping, which means getting down on her knees and praying. He does. Oh, after we read this, my kids used to refer to it as flopping for a while. It's very fun. Bust me if she ain't at it again. A woman of orderly and industrious appearance rose from her knees in a corner, with sufficient haste and trepidation to show that she was the person referred to. What? Said Mr. Cruncher, looking out of bed for a boot. You're at it again, are ya? After hailing the morn with this second salutation, he threw a boot at the woman as a third. It was a very muddy boot, and May introduced the odd circumstance connected with Mr. Cruncher's domestic economy, that, whereas he often came home after banking hours with clean boots, he often got up next morning to find the same boots covered with clay. What? Said Mr. Cruncher, varying his apostrophe after missing his mark. What are you up to, aggrawator? I was only saying my prayers. Saying your prayers? You're a nice woman. What do you mean by flopping yourself down and praying against me? I was not praying against you. I was praying for you. You weren't, and if you were, I wouldn't be took the liberty with. Here, your mother's a nice woman, young Jerry, praying against your father's prosperity. You've got a dutiful mother, boy, going and flopping herself down and praying that the bread and butter may be snatched out of the mouth of her only child. It goes on. So apparently, here's what we know about Jerry Cruncher. He thinks recalled to life would be not good for his business. I'd be in a bad way if recalled to life became a fashion. He comes home with clean boots, but somehow in the night his boots get all dirty and covered in clay. We also, at one point that I won't bother to look up, find out his fingers are always covered in rust.
Yeah.
For some reason, he's always sucking the rust off of his fingers. What does he do? We shall see. We shall see. Yes, this is Jerry Cruncher. Okay, and he brings the message, and they go to rescue Monsieur Manette. And as one of you told me, he is not in his right mind anymore. Where is he? Where is he staying while he waits to be picked up by his the Defarges? Tell me, what are the Defarges like? Who are they? What's their deal?
He technically owns a winery, Mr. Defarge, and his wife is always knitting, constantly knitting.
Constantly knitting. She never stops.
And everyone in the shop is called Jacques.
And everyone in the shop is called Jacques. This is very strange. Go ahead.
It's like a code name, right?
It's code name.
I'm guessing, isn't it like the revolutionists? Isn't that one of the stories? Because then there's Jacques Robespierre, that's his name, right? Is it Jacques Robespierre? The guy that led, control.
Possibly. I don't remember, but it's a common. It's like calling people John or Jack or something, or Joe. It's a very common name, but everybody isn't named Jacques in France. Mr. Dickens was once again not very subtle. but it's beautiful even when he's not subtle. In the suburb of Saint Antoine, where the Defarges, how are people doing in that suburb, by the way? Is life good for those people? Oh my goodness, it's awful. It's awful. They're on the edge of famine and death. And this is another, this guy who traveled through France. He said, he met a woman, and she was talking about how poorly their family was doing, and they only had one cow that didn't really give milk and everything. And he says, this woman, at no great distance, might have been taken for 60 or 70. Her figure was so bent, and her face so furrowed and hardened by labor. But she said she was only 28. That's what the life is like for people. He mentions filth and poverty. This is what it's like in St. Antoine. And one day, somebody was bringing a wine cask in, and the wine cask broke. And of course, there's only one thing to do, and that's slurp up as much wine as you possibly can before it all runs away, because it's gone. Everybody grab buckets, grab anything you got. Just stick your mouth to it and drink it out of the puddles, because you're not going to get this very often. It says, the wine was red wine, and had stained the ground of the narrow street in the suburb of Saint Antoine in Paris, where it was spilled. It had stained many hands, too, and many faces, and many naked feet, and many wooden shoes. The hands of the man who sawed the wood left red marks on the billets, and the forehead of the woman who nursed the baby was stained with the stain of the old rag she wound about her head again. Those who had been greedy with the staves of the cask had acquired a tigerish smear about the mouth, and one tall joker so besmirched, his head more out of a long squalid bag of a nightcap than in it, scrawled upon a wall with his finger dipped in muddy wine lees, blood. The time was to come when that wine, too, would be spilled on the street stones, and when the stain of it would be read upon many there.
Talking about the revolution when people get killed on the streets.
He says, the mill which had worked them down was the mill that grinds young people old. The children had ancient faces and grave voices, and upon them and upon the grown faces, and plowed into every furrow of age and coming up afresh, was the sign, hunger. That's what it's like in St. Antoine. Well, why in the world is Monsieur Manette in a room upstairs there? Do you remember? How did he end up there after he got out of prison? Why is he waiting there for Mr. Lorry and his daughter?
That's where he arrived?
They brought him there from the prison. Mr. Defarge came and collected him when he was let out for unclear reasons at this point. Mr. Defarge was a former servant in the Manette's household before he was a wine shop owner. 18 years ago, 20 years ago, he was a servant. He knows the Manettes. He was a servant of theirs. He was a loyal servant. So when he found out his old master was getting released, he brought him there. Now, this is where the Jacques come in. Defarge feigned not to notice the two strangers and fell into discourse with the triumvirate of customers who were drinking at the counter. How goes it, Jacques? Said one of these three to Monsieur Defarge. Is all the spilt wine swallowed? Every drop, Jacques, answered Monsieur Defarge. When this interchange of Christian name had been effected, Madame Defarge, picking her teeth with her toothpick, coughed another grain of cough and raised her eyebrows by the breadth of another line. It is not often, said the second of the three, addressing Monsieur Defarge, that many of these miserable beasts know the taste of wine, or of anything but black bread and death. Is not that so, Jacques? It is so, Jacques, Monsieur Defarge answered. At this second interchange of the Christian name, Madame Defarge, still using her toothpick with profound composure, coughed another grain of cough and raised her eyebrows by the breadth of another line. The last of the three now said his say, and as he put down his empty drinking vessel and smacked his lips. Ah, so much the worse. A bitter taste it is that such poor cattle always have in their mouths, and hard lives they live. Jacques, am I right, Jacques? You are right, Jacques, was the response of Monsieur Defarge. This third interchange of the Christian name was completed at the moment when Madame Defarge put her toothpick by, kept her eyebrows up, and slightly rustled in her seat. What do the three Jacques do right after this? Do you remember? He takes them somewhere. What do they want to do? It's the code word for something.
Don't they also say hi to Mrs. Defarge and then they walk into like another room?
They walk into another room. Gentleman, said her husband, who had kept his bright eye observantly upon her, good day. The chamber, furnished bachelor fashion, that you wish to see and were inquiring for when I stepped out, is on the 5th floor. The doorway of the staircase gives on the little courtyard close to the left here, pointing with his hand, near to the window of my establishment. But now that I remember, one of you has already been there and can show the way. Gentlemen, adieu. What is up the stairs off the courtyard? Mr. Manette.
Didn't they want to examine him?
They want to look at it. They just want to check him out. Now, at this point in the story, we don't know why. But Mr. Manette, remember, is Exhibit A of the terrible things that can happen to a person in France, right? They throw you in prison until you lose your mind, and that's all we know in the story so far. That Neil got Jacques is a code word, and it means you're in on the secret. You're in on it. Okay. Let us move on. And I apologize. I must have been very tired, and it must have been very late. The next question, first of all, it's not chapter 4, it's chapter 3. And second of all, it's not called disappointed, it's called the disappointment.
Yeah, I was kind of confused.
I am really sorry. This is what happens when I do too many of these at one time, and I screw up. Well, just tell me, what's the disappointment? What's the disappointment in the chapter that is not called? He was acquitted. Oh my gosh. This is the chapter in which we find out that the people of England are not a whole lot better than the people of France. Let me read this. This is about the Old Bailey, where the court cases are. And it says, the Old Bailey was famous as a kind of deadly inn-yard from which pale travelers set out continually in carts and coaches on a violent passage into the other world, traversing some 2.5 miles of public street and road, and shaming few good citizens, if any. So powerful its use, so desirable to be good use in the beginning. It was famous, too, for the pillory, a wise old institution that inflicted punishment of which no one could foresee the extent. Also for the whipping post, another dear old institution, very humanizing and softening to behold in action. Also for extensive transactions in blood money, another fragment of ancestral wisdom, systematically leading to the most frightful mercenary crimes that could be committed under heaven. Altogether, the Old Bailey at that date was a choice illustration of the precept that whatever is right. And you may not recall, this is Alexander Pope's essay on man. We've already quoted it several times. That big long poem I brought that was stapled into whatever is right. So, Jerry Cruncher is there to see and run a note back to Tellson's when the trial is over. What's on? He asked in a whisper of the man he found himself next to. Nothing yet. What's coming on? The treason case. The quartering one, eh? Ah, returned the man with a relish. He'll be drawn on a hurdle to be half hanged, and then he'll be taken down and sliced before his own face, and then his inside will be taken out and burnt while he looks on, and then his head will be chopped off, and he'll be cut into quarters. That's the sentence. If he's found guilty, you mean to say, Jerry added by way of proviso. Oh, they'll find him guilty, said the other. Don't you be afraid of that. And then when he's acquitted, there's like, oh, there'll be no hanging and quartering today. What is Mr. Charles Darnay accused of doing?
Working with some sort of cult or something?
Not a cult. He's working with somebody doing something, they think, but what?
Isn't it because of his travels between France and England? Like he's accused of treason against the king?
He keeps going back and forth to France and bringing papers back and forth and talking to Frenchmen. And do we all recall enough history to know that England and France don't really get along? Yeah, it's like the French are up to no good as far as England is concerned. I mean, it was legitimate. For a while, the French were trying to, like bump off Queen Elizabeth and put a Catholic in place. And at this point, in 1775, they're not anymore. But it's a lot of centuries of animosity to get over. And like, oh, those French. And it's the Catholic Protestant thing too, right? This is still alive. We don't trust those Catholic countries. And so Charles Darnay has been going back and forth to France over and over. And here's what the prosecutor says. That a certain patriot has brought this to the attention of the authorities, that this patriot would be produced before them, that the lofty example of this immaculate and unimpeachable witness for the crown had communicated itself to the prisoner's servant and had engendered him in a holy determination to examine his master's table drawers and pockets and secrete his papers. So this guy, for some reason, he thinks Darnay's up to no good. And he's in communication with Darnay's servant. And he says, go in there and rifle through his desk and steal his papers. We're bringing him up on charges. This man's name was one of them, Barsad, John Barsad, and Roger Cly. When Mr. Barsad gets on the stand and is cross-examined by Mr. Stryver, the lawyer for the defense, had he ever been a spy himself? No, he scorned the base insinuation. What did he live upon? His property. Where was his property? He didn't precisely remember where it was. What was it? No business of anybody's. Had he inherited it? Yes, he had. From whom? Distant relation. Very distant? Rather. Ever been in prison? Certainly not. Never in a debtor's prison? Come, once again, never? Yes. How many times? 2 or 3 times. Not 5 or 6? Perhaps. And so already, from this, like, okay, this guy is not telling the truth. He's so not telling the truth. Now, why are Mr. Manette and his daughter at the trial?
They're witnesses for his travel.
They're witnesses. Unfortunately, they're witnesses for the prosecution, even though they don't want to be, because the ship that brought them to England, Charles Darnay was on it. And so they said to Mr. Manette, so see this guy talking to French people? See him? He's like, well, don't really know. It's like, oh, Mr. Manette, were you the unfortunate victim of incarceration? And it says that his face kind of goes dark. So he's okay now, right? Like he knows who he is, and whose his daughter is, and he knows where he lives and everything. But he has moments, right, when they remind him he went a little dark. He's like, yes, I was. So I don't really remember anything of that trip. Like, okay. So they bring on Lucy. He's like, yes, he's really nice to me. He's took care of us. And she's like crying, I'm so sorry, Mr. Darnay. And finally the lawyer says, look, if he doesn't know that you are testifying against your will, he is the only person in the courtroom who doesn't know. We all know you're testifying against your will. Just say it. Like, well, I don't know. Yes, I saw him talking to Frenchmen. Yes, I saw them exchange papers. I'm so sorry. Okay. But through an amazing stroke of good fortune, Something happens, and it leads to his acquittal. What was it? What amazing thing happened that blew up the prosecution's case? I'm so glad I asked, because this is really important.
Something to do with Sidney Carton.
Sidney Carton noticed something. Here's the testimony. I saw him. He is the man. Charles Darnay. I saw him on that ship. I saw him there. I can identify him in the courtroom. I'm 100% positive that's him. And Sidney Carton's sitting there. Mr. Stryver's the lawyer. And Sidney Carton, I'm going to ask you about Sidney Carton in a minute. He's interesting. He noticed something. What did he notice? And no one else noticed. Oh, I got to find it, because this is a key plot point. So you're going to be patient with me for just a moment. What's before that? Okay. A singular circumstance then arose in the case. The object in hand being to show that the prisoner went down with some fellow plotter untracked in the Dover mail on that Friday night in November 5 years ago, and got out of the mail in the night as a blind, at a place where he did not remain, but from which he traveled back some dozen miles or more to a garrison and dockyard and there collected information. A witness was called to identify him as having been at the precise time required in the coffee room of a hotel in that garrison and dockyard town, waiting for another person. The prisoner's counsel was cross-examining this witness with no result, except they had never seen the prisoner on any other occasion, when the wigged gentleman, who had all this time been looking at the ceiling of the court, wrote a word or two on a little piece of paper, screwed it up, and tossed it to him. Opening this piece of paper in the next pause, the counsel looked with great attention and curiosity at the prisoner. You say again you are quite sure that it was the prisoner. The witness was quite sure. Did you ever see anybody very like the prisoner? Not so like, the witness said, that he could be mistaken. Look well upon that gentleman, my learned friend there, pointing to him who had tossed the paper over, and then look well upon the prisoner. How say you? Are they very like each other? Allowing for my learned friend's appearance being careless and slovenly, if not debauched, they were sufficiently like each other to surprise not only the witness but everybody present when they were thus brought into comparison. My lord being prayed to bid my learned friend to lay aside his wig, and giving no very gracious consent, the likeness became much more remarkable. My lord inquired of Mr. Stryver, the prisoner's counsel, whether they were next to try Mr. Carton, the name of my learned friend, for treason? But Mr. Stryver replied to my lord, no, but he would ask the witness to tell him whether what happened once might happen twice, whether he would have been so confident if he had seen this illustration of his rashness sooner, whether he would be so confident having seen it, and more. The upshot of which was to smash his witness like a crockery vessel and shiver his part of the case to useless lumber. When you have somebody swear, that's him. Yeah, do you notice this guy looks a lot like this guy? If there's one guy that looks a lot like this guy, could there not be another guy? Can you swear with 100% surety this is the guy you saw there? I can't. I mean, the whole courtroom could see. Mr. Carton looks freakishly like Mr. Darnay. They just really, really resemble each other. And it blew up the case and it got him off the hook. What kind of man is Sidney Carton? How does he spend his time or his nights?
He's kind of drinking.
There's a lot of alcohol involved in Mr. Carton's life. Heavy, heavy amounts of alcohol. Unless was sleeping it off. And then going to Mr. Stryver's, while Mr. Stryver lays on a couch And Mr. Carton wraps a wet towel around his head to like sober him up a little bit, and he does all their legal papers all night long for Mr. Stryver. He does all their accounts and
While they're drinking.
yeah, and Mr. Stryver doesn't do any. He does all his work and drinks and then sleeps it off till noon, and yeah, that's Mr. Carton's life. And Stryver even says to him, oh, I wonder where that is. Stryver even says, you know, you could have done something with your life. You know, I mean, you could have been something. And the chapter's called The Jackal. He says jackal.
Yeah, the jackal and like Stryver's the lion.
Yes, yes. Oh, he says, you were very sound today, Sidney, in the matter of those crown witnesses today. Every question told. I'm always sound, am I not? I don't gainsay it. What has roughened your temper? Put some punch to it and smooth it again. By the way, what has roughened his temper? What did Sidney decide to do after the trial was over? Do you remember? He went out with someone.
Yeah, he went out with Darnay.
He went out with Charles Darnay and had a drink,
Yeah.
had several drinks,
Yeah.
and then said, I'm going to sleep now on this bench and wake me up at midnight. And was kind of rude to him. He was just rather like, you know, do you like me? Charles Darnay's like, well, I don't really know. He's like, well, I don't like you much. You don't have to like me. And did anybody get a vibe? This is asking a little much of you. Why Sidney Carton might not like Charles Darnay very much? There's a lot of answers to this question that we'll find out as we read the book, but there's one in particular.
Was it because they both like Lucy Manette? And including Stryver, too.
Lucy Manette's so pretty. And if you notice, she's about to faint,
Yeah.
and the one who notices is Sidney Carton. He's like, look to the lady, look to the lady. And then he says, okay, I'll take a message to the prisoner, but it's not good if you are seen talking to. He's for a heavy drinking scrounge, he's highly attentive to Miss Manette. And it's obvious to the whole court that Miss Manette is, you know, kind of sweet on Charles Darnay. And so, yeah, he doesn't like him. So he's come back to Stryver's. It's the middle of the night. It's the middle of the night. But they're going to drink some more. What's roughened your temper? With a deprecatory grunt, the jackal again complied. The old Sidney Carton of the Shrewsbury School, said Stryver, nodding his head over him as he reviewed him in the present and the past. The old seesaw Sidney, up one minute and down the next, now in spirits and now in despondency. Ah, returned the other, sighing. Yes, the same Sidney with the same luck. Even then I did exercises for the other boys and seldom did my own. And why not? God knows. It was my way, I suppose. Sidney Carton is a self-admitted drunk and wastrel and who's never going to amount to anything. By choice, apparently. But he's got one thing. He just looks a lot like Charles Darnay. And he saved his life. So, has someone else now been recalled to life? In a sense? Charles Darnay, right? Mr. Manette and Charles Darnay. Okay, that is what's going on in England. They have moved into a little corner house, Mr. Manette and Miss Pross, where hundreds of people supposedly are always walking back and forth, and all apparently want her ladybird.
Yeah,
but
but she
there's-
also has a cousin.
Yes, yes, her little ladybird. The book, the second, is called The Golden Thread. Who or what is the golden thread, do you think?
The hair on her.
Hmm?
Blonde hair.
And who is the possessor of the blonde hair?
Oh, Mr. Manette. Right? I mean, well,
Who's the possessor of the beautiful blonde hair?
Darnie.
Lucy Manette, right?
Lucy. We meet it in the, it's okay. You guessed everybody that could have hair. Except you didn't guess Mr. Laurie.
Had the one.
I'm taking care of her.
That's so right. So I want to go back into book the first when he's still in the Defarge's garret, you know, and it says this. Hold on. Oh, okay. No, that's not it. Oh. Okay, hang on. Oh, this has got to be the chapter. Oh, yay. Okay. Her golden hair, which she wore in long curls, had been hurriedly pushed aside and fell down over her neck. Advancing his hand little by little, he took it up and looked at it. Her dad, all right, but he's still a shoemaker, right? In the midst of the action, he went astray, and with another deep sigh, fell to his work of shoemaking. But not for long. Releasing his arm, she laid her hand upon his shoulder. After looking doubtfully at it 2 or 3 times, as if to be sure that it was really there, he laid down his work, put his hand to his neck, and took off a blackened string with a scarp of folded rag attached to it. He opened this carefully on his knee, and it contained a very little quantity of hair, not more than 1 or 2 long, golden hairs, which he had in some old day wound off upon his finger. He took her hair into his hand again and looked closely at it. It is the same. How can it be? When was it? How was it? As the concentrating expression returned to his forehead, he seemed to be conscious that it was in hers too. He turned her full to the light and looked at her. She laid her head on my shoulder the night when I was summoned out. She had a fear of my going, though I had none. And when I was brought to the North Tower, they found these upon my sleeve. You believe me, them? They can never help me to escape in the body, though they may in the spirit. Those were the words I said. I remember them very well. He formed this speech with his lips many times before he could utter it, but when he did find spoken words for it, they came to him coherently, though slowly. How was this? Was it you? Who does he think she is?
His wife.
His wife's hair is wrapped up in a little rag that he's tied around his neck for 18 years to remind him she's the golden thread. And not to mention the reason they're all together, right? Miss Pross, and Mr. Laurie comes, and Mr. Carton comes, Mr. Stryver comes, and they're all centered around this family with the hundreds of people that apparently want to come. All right, that's enough of England. Let's look at France. What kind of man is the Marquis?
He loves chocolate.
Actually, that's Monsignor. So at the beginning we see this high up official in the court, right, and the church, and he's got 5 people to make his cocoa,
Yeah.
right? He's very, very highfalutin. The Marquis is one of the visitors to Monsignor, right, that we meet, and he gets dissed. You know, only certain people get admitted to an audience with Monsignor, and the Marquis, in this case, did not. And he gets ticked off about it. So he gets in his carriage to go home. And what does he do?
Runs over it.
He runs over a kid in the street and kills it. By the way, here's another lovely time to talk about my guy who traveled through France. He said, walking, which in London is so pleasant and so clean that ladies do it every day, is here a toil and a fatigue to a man, and an impossibility to a well-dressed woman. The coaches are numerous, and what is much worse, there are an infinity of one-horse cabriolets, which are driven by young men of fashion and their imitators, alike fools, with such rapidity as to be real nuisances, and render the streets exceedingly dangerous without incessant caution. I saw a poor child run over and probably killed. and have been myself many times blackened with the mud of the kennels. This happened. This sort of thing happened. French noblemen just careened through the streets willy-nilly and ran people over. So, yes, as he's leaving, this is what happens. At last, swooping at a street corner by a fountain, one of its wheels came to a sickening little jolt, and there was a loud cry from a number of voices, and the horses reared and plunged. But for the latter inconvenience, the carriage probably would not have stopped. Carriages were often known to drive on and leave their wounded behind, and why not? But the frightened valet had got down in a hurry, and there were 20 hands at the horses' bridles. "What has gone wrong?" said Monsieur, calmly looking out. A tall man in a nightcap had caught up a bundle from among the feet of the horses and laid it on the basement of the fountain, and was down in the mud and wet, howling over it like a wild animal. "Pardon, Monsieur the Marquis," said a ragged and submissive man. "It is a child." "Why does he make that abominable noise? Is it his child?" "Excuse me, Monsieur the Marquis. It is a pity, yes." The fountain was a little removed, for the street opened where it was into a space some 10 or 12 yards square. As the tall man suddenly got up from the ground and came running at the carriage, Monsieur the Marquis clapped his hand for an instant on his sword hilt. "Killed!" shrieked the man in wild desperation, extending both arms at their length above his head and staring at him. "Dead!" The people closed round and looked at Monsieur the Marquis. There was nothing revealed by the many eyes that looked at him, but watchfulness and eagerness. There was no visible menacing or anger. Neither did the people say anything. After the first cry, they had been silent, and they remained so. The voice of the submissive man who had spoken was flat and tame in its extreme submission. Monsieur the Marquis ran his eyes over them all, as if they had been mere rats come out of their holes. He took out his purse. "It is extraordinary to me," said he, "that you people cannot take care of yourselves and your children. One or other of you is forever in the way. How do I know what injury you have done to my horses? See? Give him that." He threw out a gold coin for the valet to pick up, and all the heads craned forward that all the eyes might look down at it as it fell. The tall man called out again with the most unearthly cry, "Dead!" He was arrested by the quick arrival of another man, for whom the rest made way. On seeing him, the miserable creature fell upon his shoulder, sobbing and crying, and pointing to the fountain, where some women were stooping over the motionless bundle and moving gently about it. They were as silent, however, as the men. I know all," said the last comer. "Be a brave man, my Gaspard. It is better for the poor little plaything to die so than to live. It has died in a moment without pain. Could it have lived an hour as happily?" "You are a philosopher, you there," said the Marquis, smiling. "How do they call you?" "They call me Defarge." "Of what trade?" "Monsieur the Marquis, vendor of wine." "Pick up that, philosopher and vendor of wine," said the Marquis, throwing him another gold coin, "and spend it as you will. The horses there, are they right?" Without deigning to look at the assemblage a second time, Monsieur the Marquis leaned back in his seat, and was just being driven away with the air of a gentleman who had accidentally broken some common thing, and had paid for it, and could afford to pay for it, when his ease was suddenly disturbed by a coin flying into his carriage and ringing on the floor. "Hold!" said Monsieur the Marquis. "Hold the horses! Who threw that?" He looked to the spot where Defarge, the vendor of wine, had stood a moment before. But the wretched father was groveling on his face on the pavement in that spot, and the figure that stood beside him was the figure of a dark, stout woman knitting. Monsieur the Marquis heads home, and he's waiting for a visitor. Who's his visitor? Who comes to visit Monsieur the Marquis? Charles Darnay. Why?
Are they related somehow?
It's his uncle. Monsieur the Marquis is Charles Darnay's uncle. And we find out something. Charles Darnay thinks his uncle is a rotter. And he is. Charles Darnay's dad is dead. his uncle's brother, you know, who was also a rotter. And Charles Darnay has been trying to unload all his share of everything. It's like, I want nothing to do with the family. We found out his name is Evremond, the Evremond family. No, I don't want the stuff. I don't want the fortune. I want you to dispose of it. I want to get all my name taken off all the records. Anything to do with you. I have made a new life for myself in England. Charles Darnay is not a traitor. In fact, he's a very, very good man, right? Who just doesn't want to have anything to do with these terrible, terrible people. So, but before that happens, it says, Monsieur the Marquis, in his traveling carriage, which might have been lighter, conducted by 4 post horses and 2 postilions, fagged up a steep hill. We don't know why at the time, but hopefully you remember. Why does Dickens tell us he was in his traveling carriage, which might have been lighter? What's on the carriage that's making it heavier?
Wasn't it a person?
It's a person. It's a stowaway. You get to the town. Oh, by the way, the town that the Marquis is kind of ruler over. Here's a description. Few children were to be seen and no dogs. As to the men and women, their choice on earth was stated in the prospect. Life on the lowest terms they could sustain it, down in the little village under the mill, or captivity and death in the dominant prison on the crag. That's life in the Marquis' little village. And interestingly, our traveler from England in 87 through 89 said, the people almost as wild as their country, and their town of Combourg is one of the most brutal, filthy places that can be seen. Mud houses, no windows, and a pavement so broken as to impede all passengers, but ease none. Yet here is a chateau, and inhabited. Who is this Monsieur de Chateaubriand, the owner, that has nerves strung for a residence amidst us, such filth and poverty? This was the thing. The nobility live in the palace, in the chateau, and drink the finest wine and eat the finest food. And the people in the village are starving to death. So he pulls into the village and, bring me hither that fellow, said the Marquis to the courier. The fellow was brought cap in hand, and the other fellows closed round to look and listen in the manner of the people at the Paris fountain. I passed you on the road? Monseigneur, it is true. I had the honor of being passed by you on the road. Coming up the hill and at the top of the hill, both? Monseigneur, it is true. What did you look at so fixedly? Monseigneur, I looked at the man. He stooped a little, and with his tattered blue cap pointed under the carriage. All the fellows stooped to look under the carriage. What man, pig? And why look there? Pardon, Monseigneur, he swung by the chain of the shoe, the drag. Who? Demanded the traveler. Monseigneur, the man. May the devil carry away these idiots. How do you call the man? You know all the men of this part of the country. Who was he? Your clemency, Monseigneur. He was not of this part of the country. Of all the days of my life, I never saw him. Swinging by the chain? To be suffocated? Well, with your gracious permission, that was the wonder of it, Monseigneur. His head hanging over, like this. He turned himself sideways to the carriage and leaned back with his face thrown up to the sky and his head hanging down, and then recovered himself, fumbled with his cap, and made a bow. What was he like? Monseigneur, he was whiter than the miller, all covered with dust, white as a spectre, tall as a spectre. The picture produced an immense sensation in the little crowd, but all eyes, without comparing notes with other eyes, looked at Monsieur the Marquis. There's a stowaway underneath. Who is he? Maybe. Who might want to stow away under the Marquis's carriage? And what did he do later that night? I'll remind you, it was pretty dramatic. I'd be very surprised if you don't remember how it ended. After talking to his nephew and not being very happy with him, It described the chateau with the stone faces, you know, like the gargoyles and everything. It says there were already people gathering, and what did it portend? It portended that there was one stone face too many up at the chateau. The Gorgon had surveyed the building again in the night and had added the one stone face wanting, the stone face for which it had waited through about 200 years. It lay back on the pillow of Monsieur the Marquis. It was like a fine mask, suddenly startled and made angry and petrified. Driven home into the heart of the stone figure attached to it was a knife. Round its hilt was a frill of paper, on which was scrawled, "Drive him fast to his tomb. This from Jacques." What's the connection between the man under the carriage and that? Okay, what did I just read to you? Because it's kind of flowery. What happened? The Marquis has been stabbed in the heart in the night. Somebody stabbed him to death with a note attached to the knife saying, "Drive him fast to his tomb," from Jacques. Who might want to kill them? I mean, maybe a lot of people.
Father of the boy who just died, and his name is Jacques. He's one of the.
Or, well, there's a lot of Jacques, and they're not
Yeah,
really
he's
Jacques. You know,
one
yeah.
of them.
Yes, he's obviously friends with Defarge because Defarge came up and he was crying on his shoulder and everything. Either the father of that child or someone else in that crowd climbed up under that carriage and stowed away and went home with him and crept in there that night and stabbed him to death. Oh, it's poetic justice. Yeah, somebody yesterday thought maybe it had been Charles Darnay did it. Like, no, Charles Darnay didn't kill his uncle. No, it was the carriage that might have been a little lighter. Might have been a little lighter. It was carrying an extra passenger. Yeah. And that's where we leave off this time. So that's the major players here. Let me ask you, is there anything else I want to ask you? Let me throw it back to you guys. Is there anything going on in the book so far, the story, and you're not totally sure what's going on with that? That covers all the important stuff. I mean, everything we've talked about today is, we want to remember that. Here's something I love about this book, and I love stories like this. Charles Dickens isn't going to tell you anything in this book that's not important. There's very little throwaway, right? It's all coming back. So when he tells you something, like, just read with attention. It's not even a bad idea to write little plot synopses. I write them sometimes in my book, although unfortunately my husband has decided to read Frankenstein, which we're going to be reading after Tale of Two Cities. And I wrote little plot synopses, and it has ruined the story for him because it was a surprise chapter, and he read my little, it's like, well, thanks for that. So now he's reading it online because he doesn't like my copy. But it can remind you anyway. Yeah, so I think those are all the major players. I'm pretty sure you're going to get to find out what Jerry Cruncher, why he has rust on his fingers and gets his boots muddy, and how he gets extra cash. Being a messenger for Tellson's Bank doesn't pay that well. Yeah, any questions you can think of? Anything that's an enigma, I'm not sure what's going on here or why. All right. Well, you know what? We're 10 minutes early, but I'm just going to shut it down. I'm not asking you to write anything. But we are going to start, and I'm just going to tell you in advance, you're going to write something over Christmas. But we have, I know, I'm just brutal. I'm like, somebody's going to stab me and put a message like this from, I don't know, give yourselves code names. But we're going to start it next week. It just so happened that way. It's our only really chance to write about this book. So we'll go over, what I want you to collect, but it won't be that much. And plus, our last class meets on the 17th, and we don't meet again until January 6th. And I feel like, I'm sorry, you do not need to celebrate from December 17th to January 6th. You can read a little bit and write a paper. And you'll be reading Frankenstein too, and it's not difficult, and it's not as long. So
Christmas goes till January 6th.
I know. So the moral of the story is we're done on December 17th, and you've got 8 days till Christmas. Write your paper, and then it's done by the 24th, and then celebrate until Epiphany. Right? There you go. Yeah. Okay.